The split-brain literature contains many examples suggesting that two conscious points of view can reside in a single brain. Most of them also topple the typical notion of free will by exposing a phenomenon generated by the left hemisphere that Gazzaniga and his colleague Joseph Ledoux dubbed the interpreter. This phenomenon occurs when the right hemisphere takes action based on information it has access to that the left hemisphere doesn't, and the left hemisphere then gives an instantaneous and false explanation for the split-brain subject's behavior. For example, when the right hemisphere is given the instruction, "take a walk," in an experiment, the subject will stand up and begin walking. But when asked why he's leaving the room, he will give an explanation such as, "Oh, I need to get a drink." His left hemisphere, the one responsible for speech, is unaware of the command the right side received, and we have every reason to think that he does in fact believe his thirst was the reason he got up and began walking. As in the example in which experimenters were able to cause a feeling of will in subjects who in actuality were not in control of their own actions, the phenomenon of the interpreter is further confirmation that the feeling we have of executing consciously willed actions, at least in some instances, is sheer illusion. Regardless of what the split-brain research tells us about conscious will, however, the more basic insight is more relevant to our discussion. Different sets of intentions in a split-brain patient seem to be relegated to distinct and separate islands of consciousness. In the example of a patient's battle with herself over buttoning up a shirt, one side feels that her right hand is being controlled by someone else, who is fighting against her action to put on a chosen shirt. The other side is rejecting a bad wardrobe choice that someone else made. In moments such as these, a split-brain patient behaves and probably feels more like two conjoined twins than like a single person. In his book, The Master and His Emissary, about the two hemispheres of the brain, the psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist describes his intriguing thesis about the possibility that consciousness originates much deeper in the structures of the brain than scientists typically believe. It seems to me more fruitful to think of consciousness not as something with sharp edges that is suddenly arrived at once one reaches the very top of mental functioning, but as a process that is gradual rather than all or nothing, and begins low down in the brain. The problem then becomes not how two wills can become one unified consciousness, but how one field of consciousness can accommodate two wills. Consciousness is not a bird, as it often seems to be in the literature, hovering, detached, coming in at the top level and alighting on the brain somewhere in the frontal lobes, but a tree, its roots deep inside us. With the revelations brought to us through split-brain research and other advances in modern neuroscience, many have been led to the following question. Is there some version of split consciousness that occurs in brains that aren't physically split? Are there other centers of consciousness, even what we might think of as other minds, residing closer to us than we think? Perhaps it's not impossible to imagine that different centers, configurations, or flows of consciousness exist in close proximity to one another or overlap, even in a single human body. 6. Is consciousness everywhere? We seem to be left without answers to the two questions with which we began this investigation. When we look closely, we can't find reliable external evidence of consciousness, nor can we conclusively point to any specific function it serves. These are both deeply counterintuitive outcomes, and this is where the mystery of consciousness starts bumping up against other mysteries of the universe. If we can't point to anything that distinguishes which collections of atoms in the universe are conscious from those that aren't, where can we possibly hope to draw the line? Perhaps a more interesting question is why we should draw a line at all. When we view our own experience of consciousness as being along for the ride, we suddenly find it easier to imagine that other systems are accompanied by consciousness as well. It's at this point that we must consider the possibility that all matter is imbued with consciousness in some sense, a view referred to as panpsychism. If the various behaviors of animals can be accompanied by consciousness, why not the reaction of plants to light, or the spin of electrons for that matter? Perhaps consciousness is embedded in matter itself, as a fundamental property of the universe. It sounds crazy, but as we will see, it's worth posing the question. The term panpsychism, coined by the Italian philosopher Francesco Patrizzi in the 16th century, is derived from the Greek pan, all, and psyche, mind or spirit. Some versions of panpsychism describe consciousness as separate from matter and composed of some other substance, a definition reminiscent of vitalism and traditional religious descriptions of a soul. But while the term has been used to describe a wide range of thinking throughout history, contemporary considerations of panpsychism provide descriptions of reality very different from the earlier versions and are unencumbered by any religious beliefs. One branch of modern panpsychism proposes that consciousness is intrinsic to all forms of information processing, even inanimate forms such as technological devices. Another goes so far as to suggest that consciousness stands alongside the other fundamental forces and fields that physics has revealed to us, like gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces. The full range of serious deliberations regarding panpsychism, whether they narrow in on certain types of information processing or apply to all matter universally, are unlike most of the panpsychic theories of the past. Modern thinking about panpsychism is informed by the sciences and is fully aligned with physicalism and scientific reasoning. I love the title of an article by the philosopher Philip Goff, "Panpsychism is crazy, but it's also most probably true." His line of thinking follows this path. Once we realize that physics tells us nothing about the intrinsic nature of the entities it talks about, and indeed that the only thing we know for certain about the intrinsic nature of matter is that at least some material things have experience, the theoretical imperative to form as simple and unified a view as is consistent with the data leads us quite straightforwardly in the direction of panpsychism. It's because of the value of simplicity that I tend to favor the branch of panpsychism that describes consciousness as fundamental to matter, as opposed to requiring a certain level of information processing for consciousness to exist. This, once again, is a result of the hard problem of consciousness, which crops up anywhere you attempt to draw a line, whether at neuronal processing or at simpler forms of information processing. Although in many ways it's more difficult to get our minds around, the view that consciousness is intrinsic to matter is a more convincing solution to me, in part because it is a simpler one, albeit only slightly. Consider the Higgs field as an analogy. Physicists knew that the Higgs field had to exist. If it didn't, the electrons and quarks that make up all of us would be massless and travel at the speed of light. For years before the discovery of its carrier, the Higgs boson, they posited a Higgs field. Although nothing about its conformation supports or provides any evidence for theories about consciousness, it helps us understand the analogous proposition in panpsychism, that perhaps consciousness is another property of matter, or of the universe itself, that we have yet to discover. In his book, Panpsychism in the West, the philosopher David Skrbina provides a survey of the history of scientific arguments for panpsychism that are based on rationalism, empirical evidence, and evolutionary principles. After Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was published, 1859, and subsequent advances in the fields of physics, chemistry, and biology revealed that human beings were composed of the same elements as other matter, the true mystery of consciousness became apparent. And the new understanding that everything in the universe consisted of the same building blocks led to further support for a scientific and evolutionary perspective entailing some form of panpsychism. The natural tendency of scientific exploration is to arrive at as simple an explanation as possible, and the concept of consciousness emerging out of non-conscious material represents a kind of failure of the typical goal of scientific explanation. In philosophy, this jump from a non-conscious to a conscious state of matter is referred to as radical or strong emergence. Skrbina quotes the celebrated biologist J.B.S. Haldane on his opposition to the notion of radical emergence, based on the inevitable complexity it adds to any explanation of consciousness. If consciousness were not present in matter, this would imply a theory of strong emergence that is fundamentally anti-scientific. Such emergence is radically opposed to the spirit of science, which has always attempted to explain the complex in terms of the simple. If the scientific point of view is correct, we shall ultimately find them, signs of consciousness in inert matter, at least in rudimentary form, all through the universe. Skirbina walks the reader through more than 300 years of contemplations by scientists, from Johannes Kepler to Roger Penrose, who take a scientific approach to panpsychism, many of whom arrive at the conclusion that the simplest explanation of consciousness is in fact a panpsychic one. About 30 years after Haldane in the 1960s, the biologist Bernhard Rensch asserted that just as there is a blurring of categories when we examine the evolution of one life form to another at the level of microorganisms and cells, the stark division between living and non-living systems is blurred, and a mistaken distinction likely carries over to the boundaries of conscious experience as well. Additionally, when scientists assume they have bypassed the hard problem by describing consciousness as an emergent property, that is, a complex phenomenon not predicted by the constituent parts, they are changing the subject. All emergent phenomena, like ant colonies, snowflakes, and waves, are still descriptions of matter and how it behaves as witnessed from the outside. What a collection of matter is like from the inside, and whether or not there is an experience associated with it, is something the term emergence doesn't cover. Calling consciousness an emergent phenomenon doesn't actually explain anything, because to the observer, matter is behaving as it always does. If some matter has awareness and some doesn't, and some emergent phenomena have awareness and some don't, the concept of emergence, as it is traditionally used in science, simply doesn't explain consciousness. Some philosophers go so far as to suggest that there isn't a hard problem of consciousness at all, reducing consciousness to an illusion. But as others have pointed out, consciousness is the one thing that can't be an illusion, by definition. An illusion can appear within consciousness, but you are either experiencing something or you're not. Consciousness is necessary for an illusion to take place. In his essay, The Consciousness Deniers, the British analytic philosopher Galen Strawson analyzes this view of consciousness as illusion and expresses exasperation with the utter incoherence of the idea. How could anybody have been led to something so silly as to deny the existence of conscious experience, the only general thing we know for certain exists? The philosopher Ned Block of NYU's Center for Neuroscience describes something he's observed in his students akin to different personality types when he lectures about the hard problem of consciousness. He estimates that about 1/3 of his students don't appreciate phenomenology, felt experience, and the difficult problem it raises, and he thinks it would be interesting to study the neurological difference between people who are able to intuitively grasp the hard problem and those who aren't, or who view it as an illusion. Regardless, relegating consciousness to the status of an illusion misses the point in my view. In effect, it's simply redefining consciousness as the illusion of consciousness. Even if we agreed to call consciousness an illusion, which seems absurd, we would still wonder how deep this illusion goes. Are other complex processes or other collections of matter experiencing this illusion? All the questions of consciousness and panpsychism would still stand before us. In fact, Strawson posits that panpsychism is the most plausible theoretical view to adopt if one is an out-and-out naturalist who holds that physicalism is true, that everything that concretely exists is physical, and that all physical phenomena are forms of energy. He concludes that panpsychism is simply a hypothesis about the ultimate intrinsic nature of this energy, the hypothesis that the intrinsic nature of energy is experience. Physics is untouched by this hypothesis. Everything true in physics remains true. Nevertheless, scientific considerations of panpsychism are still seen as controversial and are contrary to the conventional scientific view. While consciousness is notoriously difficult to study and even to define, most neuroscientists believe that it results from complex processes in the brain, and that we'll eventually discover the ultimate cause of consciousness by studying its neural correlates. Many neuroscientists do admit, however, that the hard problem will persist, because scientific understanding, no matter how complete, seems to have no way of offering us direct insight into the subjective experience associated with those physical properties. Studying systems like the brain simply delivers us more information about physical properties. The neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran, for example, has conceded that qualia, the experiential qualities of consciousness that we can label, such as what it's like to see the color blue or feel something sharp, will remain a puzzle. Qualia are vexing to philosophers and scientists alike because even though they are palpably real and seem to lie at the very core of mental experience, physical and computational theories about brain function are utterly silent on the question of how they might arise or why they might exist. Neuroscientists who study consciousness are most interested in the differences at the level of the brain between seemingly conscious and unconscious functions of the body. You're aware of reading the words on this page at this moment, but you're not aware of the activities of your kidneys, and conscious and unconscious states, being awake versus being in deep sleep, for example. There are a variety of hypotheses proposing that certain areas of the brain, or types of neural processing, create a conscious experience. Some scientists, Francis Crick and Christoph Koch among them, have even speculated that it is the frequency at which neurons fire that causes them to give rise to consciousness. Crick and Koch attempted to pinpoint the source of consciousness in the brain by conducting research on the visual system. They hoped to better understand which types of visual stimuli we process consciously, are aware of seeing, which stimuli the brain is responding to but we have no conscious awareness of, subliminal processing, and which areas of the brain are responsible for these different kinds of processing. While useful and interesting, this type of research is, once again, limited. It increases our knowledge of the brain and our human experience, but it can't tell us anything about what consciousness is in the first place, nor does it help us understand whether or not other types of systems, animate or inanimate, could be experiencing it. More recently, the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, director of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Center for Sleep and Consciousness, together with Marcello Massimini and his team at the University of Milan, formulated what may become a method for determining whether or not a person is conscious. In the procedure, nicknamed ZAP and ZIP, transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, is used to deliver a pulse of magnetic energy to the brain, and the activity of the subsequent electric current running through the cortical neurons is then read by EEG. The resulting patterns are mapped onto a perturbational complexity index, PCI. Koch explains that the method establishes a PCI cutoff value as a critical threshold, the minimum measure of complex brain activity supporting consciousness. This method attempts to detect consciousness in subjects whose level of awareness is hard to decipher from external cues, including subjects in deep sleep, anesthetized subjects, and patients in a coma. It hopefully places us one step closer to determining whether brain damage, locked-in, or late-stage dementia patients are in a minimally conscious state versus a vegetative state, or whether a surgical patient has become conscious while under anesthesia, conditions we currently have only limited tools for detecting. This is admittedly some of the most important work being done in neuroscience today. But again, questions regarding conscious versus unconscious functions or states of the brain do not necessarily address the larger questions regarding what consciousness is and how deep in the universe it runs. The fact remains, however, that the majority of scientists believe that consciousness is an emergent phenomenon resulting from neuronal processing. Most assume that if we are not conscious of certain experiences and brain processes, there must not be any experience associated with them at all. This may be true, but as we will see, it may not make sense to follow that line of reasoning. Let's inspect how this research informs, or fails to inform, panpsychic views. There are inconsistencies in many of the hypotheses put forth by scientists and philosophers. They show up in 1. Attempts to draw a line between where we are likely to find consciousness and where we are not. This usually has something to do with information processing. And 2. The failure of scientists and philosophers to overcome the strong, though probably false intuition that there can't be more than one center or system of consciousness residing in a human body. Christoph Koch is one neuroscientist who is willing to consider the panpsychic interpretation, telling an interviewer, "If you take a more conceptual approach to consciousness, the evidence suggests that there are many more systems that have consciousness, possibly all animals, all unicellular bacteria, and at some level, maybe even individual cells that have an autonomous existence. We might be surrounded by consciousness everywhere and find it in places where we don't expect it because our intuition says we'll only see it in people, and maybe monkeys and also dogs and cats. But we know our intuition is fallible, which is why we need science to tell us what the actual state of the universe is." I follow him here wholeheartedly. Then he goes on to say things like, "We know that most organs in your body do not give rise to consciousness. Your liver, for example, is very complicated, but it doesn't seem to have any feelings. If one can imagine that a worm has some level of consciousness, and that it would maintain its consciousness while residing in a human body, whether it's contributing to the scope of consciousness that I am experiencing right now is irrelevant to the question of whether the worm is experiencing something. So these separate lines of investigation, what contributes to my consciousness versus what is conscious, end up confusing the larger question about what consciousness is in the first place and where in the universe we will find it. By entertaining the notion that bacteria or individual cells could have some level of consciousness, Koch seems open to a modern version of panpsychism. Yet in the same conversation he asserts that the cerebellum, with its 69 billion neurons, does not give rise to consciousness. But just because the cerebellum is not responsible for the part of my brain that governs language or for the flow of consciousness that I consider to be me, we can still wonder whether it's another region or regions of consciousness, just as we can speculate that a worm or a bacterium might be conscious. Although Koch is here addressing consciousness in two different contexts, considering a panpsychic view in one instance and pointing to specific processes in the body that aren't included in the typical experience of consciousness in the other, the overall thinking on this subject in neuroscience and philosophy tends to be inconsistent, or at the very least a piece of the conversation is often missing. And even though, as mentioned earlier, Thomas Nagel's definition of the word consciousness, i.e. being like something, is the most accurate way to talk about subjective experience, there are a variety of ways people use the word: the capacity for self-reflection, wakefulness, alertness, etc., which causes additional confusion. But we can continue to pose questions about whether consciousness exists outside systems that can report back about it. We just have to do so on another level of conversation. When I am unconscious during a period of deep sleep, for instance, all we know is that the part of the system that makes up me has been interrupted. The continuity, and even the reality of my experience ceases for a period because the operation of that part of the system ceases. But whether consciousness itself carries on in other areas of my brain or body while the experience of me is on hold is still an open question. No matter how much knowledge we gain about the workings of the brain, the question at hand is likely to remain unanswered. How deep in the universe does consciousness run? In The Conscious Mind, David Chalmers suggests that consciousness could be manifested in the functioning of something as basic as a simple technological device. As we move along the scale from fish and slugs through simple neural networks, all the way to thermostats, where should consciousness wink out? The thermostat seems to realize the sort of information processing in a fish or slug stripped down to its simplest form. So perhaps it might also have the corresponding sort of phenomenology in its most stripped-down form. It makes one or two relevant distinctions on which action depends. To me, at least, it does not seem unreasonable that there might be associated distinctions in experience. So if it's plausible that worms or bacteria or thermostats are accompanied by some level of consciousness, however minimal and unlike our own experience, why not follow the same logic when it comes to organs in the body, or the cerebellum, which contains most of the neurons in the brain? Just because something isn't appearing in the field of what I am experiencing, why rule out the possibility that many forms of consciousness exist simultaneously within the boundaries of my body? Another potential source of erroneous arguments against panpsychism is based in evolution, as most scientific and philosophical support for the idea that consciousness is confined to the nervous systems of living things relies in part on the assertion that consciousness is a product of biological evolution. The logic is understandable, given that our most sophisticated methods of survival seem to us to require consciousness. But if consciousness doesn't determine our behavior as we have traditionally assumed, the evolution argument doesn't hold up. How can consciousness increase the likelihood of survival if it doesn't affect our behavior in the typical sense? When we look outside the context of animal life, where it's easier for us to drop our ingrained intuitions, we find that it's actually hard to intuit the logic that any amount of information processing, no matter how complex, would suddenly cause those processes to become conscious. When your golden retriever runs to greet you at the end of the day, her consciousness seems as obvious to you as any other fact. But as we've seen, even when we imagine robots that look and act like human beings, we seem to be unable to determine whether or not they would be conscious. It's only because we experience consciousness so readily and ascribe it to other life forms by analogy so easily that it seems like an obvious capacity, and that we're not continually shocked to be experiencing something in every waking moment. We should be as surprised by the reality of our own consciousness as we would be to learn that the latest smartphone is conscious. My own sense of the correct resolution to the mystery of consciousness, whether or not we can ever achieve a true understanding, is still currently split between a brain-based explanation and a panpsychic one. But while I'm not convinced that panpsychism offers the correct answer, I am convinced that it is a valid category of possible solutions that cannot be as easily dismissed as many people seem to think. Unfortunately, it remains difficult for scientists to join the conversation without fear of jeopardizing their credibility. In a 2017 essay titled Minding Matter, Adam Frank, a professor of astrophysics at the University of Rochester, eloquently expresses both the mystery of consciousness and the reluctance of scientists to propose theories that venture beyond viewing consciousness as a result of processing in the brain. It is as simple as it is undeniable. After more than a century of profound explorations into the subatomic world, our best theory for how matter behaves still tells us very little about what matter is. Materialists appeal to physics to explain the mind, but in modern physics, the particles that make up a brain remain, in many ways, as mysterious as consciousness itself. Rather than trying to sweep away the mystery of mind by attributing it to the mechanisms of matter, we must grapple with the intertwined nature of the two. Consciousness might, for example, be an example of the emergence of a new entity in the universe not contained in the laws of particles. There is also the more radical possibility that some rudimentary form of consciousness must be added to the list of things, such as mass or electric charge, that the world is built of. But while theoretical physicists can happily propose ideas such as the predictions of string theory from 10 or more dimensions of space to the vast landscape of possible universes, and still have their work get a fair hearing, it is considered a risk to one's reputation to suggest that consciousness might exist outside the brain. Frank points out a similar double standard that is applied to evaluating the various interpretations of quantum mechanics. Why does the infinity of parallel universes in the many worlds interpretation get associated with the sober, hard-nosed position, while including the perceiving subject, consciousness, gets condemned as crossing over to the shores of anti-science at best, or mysticism at worst? Although some scientists have been led naturally to a panpsychic view in one form or another, the term still carries the stink of New Age. David Skirbina explains that at first mention, the idea that the inanimate world possesses consciousness seems so anti-scientific that it incites a reflexive and concerted opposition. Upon laying out a panpsychist position, one is immediately faced with the charge that he believes that rocks are conscious, a statement taken as so obviously ludicrous that panpsychism can be safely dismissed out of hand. We may see strong analogies with the human mind in certain animals, and so we apply the concept, consciousness, to them with varying degrees of confidence. We may see no such analogies to plants or inanimate objects, and so to attribute consciousness to them seems ridiculous. This is our human bias. To overcome this anthropocentric perspective, the panpsychist asks us to see the mentality of other objects not in terms of human consciousness, but as a subset of a certain universal quality of physical things, in which both inanimate mentality and human consciousness are taken as particular manifestations. Though all the attacks on panpsychism I've read lack substantive, detailed arguments, they have been fierce. From the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Edwards, 1967, to the New York Review of Books, panpsychism has been accused of being unintelligible and breathtakingly implausible, with its adherents likened to religious fanatics. Those of us who want to push this conversation forward have an important obligation to clearly distinguish panpsychic views from the false conclusions people tend to draw from them, namely that panpsychism somehow justifies or explains a variety of psychic phenomena, following from the incorrect assumption that consciousness must entail a mind with a single point of view and complex thoughts. Ascribing some level of consciousness to plants or inanimate matter is not the same as ascribing to them human minds with wishes and intentions like our own. Anyone who believes the universe has a plan for us or that he can consult with his higher self for medical advice should not feel propped up by the modern view of panpsychism. It supports nothing of the sort. Bacteria with some minimal level of consciousness streaming through their atoms would still be bacteria. They would still lack brains and complex minds, much less human ones. As the philosopher Greg Rosenberg points out, when we entertain the notion that a bacterium or an atom possesses some level of conscious experience, we are obviously not attributing to it the qualities of our own experiences, but instead we can imagine a qualitative field that has a character in some very abstract sense, like that of our experiences, but specifically unimaginable to us and unlike our own experience of consciousness. And of course, the false conclusions drawn from a misunderstanding of panpsychism, that individual atoms, cells, or plants possess an experience comparable to that of a human mind, for instance, are often the very thing used to argue against it. Unfortunately, it seems quite hard for us to drop the intuition that consciousness equals complex thought. But if consciousness is in fact a more basic aspect of the universe than previously believed, that doesn't suddenly give credence to your neighbor's belief that she can communicate telepathically with her ficus tree. In actuality, if a version of panpsychism is correct, everything will still appear to us and behave exactly as it already does. 7. Beyond panpsychism. Imagine being a brain without any sense organs connected, floating in empty space or in a vast body of water. Then imagine your senses being connected one at a time. First vision. The only content available to you is a subtle experience of sight. You can see light, perhaps, pulsating light of varying brightness coming in and out. Try to apprehend this without including the concepts of memory or language, so that there's no sense of a self thinking, "Whoa, it was just dark, but now it's light again." Instead, try to imagine a very simple flow of first experiences. Light and dark alternating, then brighter light, dimmer light, pulsating light. Next, imagine light that takes on shapes. A circular light, a beam of light, light that extends far into the distance. Adding color, perhaps. A reddish light that transforms to orange, then yellow, then blue. Imagine feeling formless and weightless. You're free floating in space with no thoughts or concepts, no words orange or red, just the pure experience of those colors. Visualize the most basic experience imaginable. Next, bring in sounds, then tastes, then smells, each arriving one at a time in as pure a form as possible. You're simply experiencing what arrives in your awareness without words or concepts to describe what the experience is like. And finally, imagine the feeling of touch coming online in the form of pressure or heat, spanning broad areas and in small pinpoint locations. Not in your body, of course, since you don't have one, but in locations in space. It's difficult to maintain this type of imagery for long, but we can get enough of a sense of such a state to imagine that at the very least something like it is possible. Most people who have had sufficient training in meditation realize that an experience of consciousness needn't be accompanied by thoughts, or any input to the senses for that matter. It seems possible to be acutely aware of one's subjective experience in the absence of thought, sights, sounds, or any other perception. As we have seen, the feeling we have of being a concrete self and the intuitions that come along with it create formidable obstacles to thinking creatively about consciousness. These intuitions also contribute to our tendency to reflexively reject panpsychism as a plausible category of theories, even when so many arrows of logic point in its direction. But when we zoom in on the actual details, the idea looks less improbable. Rebecca Goldstein makes the case that we in fact already know that consciousness is integral to matter because we are made of matter ourselves, and it is the one property we have direct access to. Consciousness is an intrinsic property of matter. Indeed, it's the only intrinsic property of matter that we know, for we know it directly by ourselves being material conscious things. All of the other properties of matter have been discovered by way of mathematical physics, and this mathematical method of getting at the properties of matter means that only relational properties of matter are known, not intrinsic properties. Galen Strawson makes a similar point by turning the mystery of consciousness on its head. He argues that consciousness is in fact the only thing in the universe that is not a mystery, in the sense that it is the only thing we truly understand firsthand. According to Strawson, it is matter that's utterly mysterious, because we have no understanding of its intrinsic nature, and he has dubbed this the hard problem of matter. Physics tells us a great many facts about the mathematically describable structure of physical reality, facts that it expresses with numbers and equations, but it doesn't tell us anything at all about the intrinsic nature of the stuff that fleshes out this structure. Physics is silent, perfectly and forever silent on this question. What is the fundamental stuff of physical reality, the stuff that is structured in the way physics reveals? The answer again is that we don't know, except insofar as this stuff takes the form of conscious experience. Once again, it's important to distinguish between consciousness and complex thought when considering modern panpsychic views. Postulating that consciousness is fundamental isn't the same as suggesting that complex ideas or thoughts are fundamental and magically results in a material realization of those ideas, a common misinterpretation of panpsychism. The claim is just the opposite, that if consciousness exists as a fundamental property, complex systems, built from that which is already streaming consciousness, could eventually give rise to physical structures such as human minds. David Skirbina addresses the problem of anthropic projections, in which we place the demands of human consciousness on inanimate particles, and he explains the necessity of distinguishing between consciousness and memory. Certainly anything like the human mind requires a human-like memory, but this is relevant only for complex organisms. It is not reasonable to demand that atomic particles have anything like the memory capability of the human being, or even any physical instantiation of something like memory. Minds of atoms may conceivably be, for example, a stream of instantaneous, memoryless moments of experience. Though many people wonder if the most basic constituents of matter have some level of conscious experience, how could it be that when they form a more complex physical object or system, those smaller points of consciousness combine to create a new, more complex sphere of consciousness? For instance, if all the individual atoms and cells in my brain are conscious, how do those separate spheres of consciousness merge to form the consciousness I'm experiencing? What's more, do all the smaller individual points of consciousness cease to exist after giving birth to an entirely new point of consciousness? This is referred to as the combination problem, which the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy describes as the hardest problem facing panpsychism, noting, "The problem is that this is very difficult to make sense of. Little conscious subjects of experience with their micro-experiences coming together to form a big conscious subject with its own experiences. The idea of many minds forming some other mind is much harder to get your head around, so to speak." For many scientists and philosophers, the combination problem presents the biggest obstacle to accepting any description of reality that includes consciousness as a widespread feature. However, the obstacle we face here once again seems to be a case of confusing consciousness with the concept of a self, as philosophers and scientists tend to speak in terms of a subject of consciousness. The term self is usually used to describe a more complex set of psychological characteristics, including qualities such as self-confidence or capacity for empathy, but a subject still describes an experience of self in its most basic form. In a paper discussing the problem that combination poses, David Chalmers writes, "How could any phenomenal relation holding between distinct subjects suffice for the constitution of a wholly new subject? But perhaps it's wrong to talk about a subject of consciousness, and it's more accurate instead to talk about the content available to conscious experience at any given location in space-time, determined by the matter present there." Umwelts applied not just to organisms, but to all matter in every configuration and at every point in spacetime. Viewed in this way, the combination problem no longer seems to be an obstacle to all versions of panpsychism. Rather, it may be an additional reason to favor a perspective in which consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, as opposed to being confined to some level of information processing. Considering consciousness to be fundamental allows for matter to have a certain internal character everywhere, in all its different forms. And in this view, consciousness is not interacting with itself as it would be in the act of combining. This line of thinking yields interesting questions. Does certain content appear in an area of consciousness, depending on the matter present in that location in spacetime? Are there overlapping experiences, as well as merging experiences of content? In a recent conversation I had with Christoph Koch, we discussed what might result from a hypothetical experiment in which two brains were connected together as successfully as the two hemispheres of an ordinary brain are connected. Since it seems as though the mind and the contents of consciousness can be divided in a split-brain patient, would two brains wired together produce a new integrated mind? If Christoph and I had our brains wired together, for instance, would it create a new Christoph-Annika consciousness? A new single point of view? Would a new mind be produced with access to all the content that had previously been experienced separately by our brains? All our thoughts, memories, fears, abilities, and so forth, constituting a new person? Even if the answer is yes, which it probably is, I don't think we encounter a combination problem in this thought experiment. We run into problems only if we see the conscious experiences of myself and Christoph as selves or subjects, permanent structures of consciousness with fixed boundaries. In the instance of connecting two brains, we might simply have an example of consciousness changing its content or character, in the same way that the content of your consciousness changes when you close and open your eyes. The trees and sky are available to your field of view, and then they're not. When you dream, you experience environments quite different from your actual surroundings, maybe even feeling yourself to be a different person altogether. And in deep sleep, you lose consciousness entirely, only to gain it back again. During both of my pregnancies, I found myself experiencing drastic variations in the contents of my consciousness. Sensations in my uterus I had never before known were on the menu of experience. An obsession with tomatoes and tomato sauces in every form, feelings of panic and other more amorphous emotional rides, physical pain, insomnia. I didn't feel like myself, and I expect I wouldn't feel like myself during a mind meld with a 60-year-old male neuroscientist either, but it doesn't necessarily point to a combination problem for consciousness. Even in our daily lives, content comes and goes, and consciousness itself can seem to flicker in and out. We run into a combination problem only when we drag the concept of a self or a subject into the equation. But we know that the idea of the self as a concrete entity is an illusion. It's admittedly a very tough illusion to relinquish, but I think the solution to the combination problem is that there is really no combining going on at all with respect to consciousness itself. Consciousness could persist as is, while the character and content change, depending on the arrangement of the specific matter in question. Maybe content is sometimes shared across large, intricately connected regions and sometimes confined to very small ones, perhaps even overlapping. If two human brains were connected, both people might feel as if the content of their consciousness had simply expanded, with each person feeling a continuous transformation from the content of one person to the whole of the two until the connection was more or less complete. It's only when you insert the concepts of him, her, you, and me as discrete entities that the expanding of content for any area of consciousness, or even multiple areas merging, becomes a combination problem. It reminds me of the classic device of characters switching places in a story or film, giving them an experience of what it's like to be someone else. When we look closely at what this actually entails, it becomes impossible to even pose the question. Where's the me that would switch if I became someone else? Being someone else would be no different from what it's already like to be that person. It seems paradoxical, but we end up simply stating the obvious. That's what it's like to be over there as that configuration of atoms, and this is what it's like to be over here as this configuration of atoms. It's analogous to saying, the configuration of atoms that compose a leaf result in all its expected leaf properties, and a collection of H2O molecules take on the expected properties of water. That's what molecules do in that configuration, and this is what they do in this configuration. Likewise, that's what molecules feel like in that configuration, and this is what they feel like in this configuration. We are again led back to a view of primary concepts, consciousness and content. If consciousness doesn't need to combine in the way many have assumed it must for a panpsychic reality to be possible, then we don't face a combination problem at all. As we have seen, experiences of consciousness need not be continuous or maintained as individual selves or subjects, nor do they necessarily need to be extinguished when the smaller constituents of matter combine to make more complex systems like brains. The illusion of being a self, along with an experience of continuity over time through memory, may in fact be a very rare form of consciousness. Whatever the larger reality is, the particular experience we have is dictated by the structure and function of our brain, which may not offer us a helpful starting point for understanding the actual nature of consciousness. Is it possible that alongside the conscious experience of me, there is a much dimmer experience of each individual neuron, or of different collections of neurons and cells in my body and beyond? Could the universe literally be teeming with consciousness, flickering in and out, overlapping, combining, separating, flowing in ways we can't quite imagine, depending on the laws of physics in a way we don't yet understand? Perhaps the term panpsychism, because of its history and associations, will continue to pose obstacles to progress in the field, and we need a new label for the work in which philosophers and scientists theorize about the possibility that consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter. Just as we have branches of physics, theoretical and experimental, we might need to come up with a new term for this branch of consciousness studies, distinguishing it from the work of neuroscientists who study the neural correlates of consciousness. Theories that entail panpsychism have been gaining respect in recent years, but they are still vulnerable to being nudged off the academic stage. In his article, Conscious Spoons Really? Pushing Back Against Panpsychism, Anil Seth expresses a common view among neuroscientists that consciousness science has moved on from grappling with Chalmers' hard problem, and thus from such fringe solutions as panpsychism. He insists that by building increasingly sophisticated bridges between mechanism and phenomenology, the apparent mystery of the hard problem may dissolve. However, the two lines of inquiry, attempting to understand which brain processes give rise to our human experience versus what consciousness is in the first place, can coincide, even if they may not necessarily inform each other. As is the case in physics, neuroscientists need not spend a moment studying theoretical ideas they're not interested in, but they need not get in the way of studying those ideas either. The theoretical work in science is often a necessary starting point and just as vital to scientific progress as the experimental work that follows. It's important to clarify a few points regarding the distinction I continue to draw between two categories of questions: those pertaining to how deep in the universe consciousness runs, and those about the brain processes that give rise to our human experiences, along with the value I place on each of them. First, although I'm defending panpsychism as a legitimate category of theories about consciousness based on what we currently know, I am not closed to the possibility that we might discover, by some future scientific method, that consciousness does in fact exist only in brains. It's hard for me to see how we could ever arrive at this understanding with any certainty, but I don't rule it out. Nor am I discounting the possibility that consciousness is something we will never fully grasp. Rebecca Goldstein is likely right when she suggests that the mystery of consciousness is impervious to scientific methods. It is somewhat depressing to think of an absolute limit on our science, to know that there are things we can never know. Mathematical physics has yielded knowledge of so many of the properties of matter. However, the fact that we material objects have experiences should convince us that it cannot, alas, yield knowledge of them all. Unless a new Galileo appears, who offers us a way of getting at properties of matter that need not be mathematically expressible, we will never make any scientific progress on the hard problem of consciousness. Furthermore, my focus is on the mystery presented by the hard problem of consciousness because I think it is underappreciated and needs our attention, especially as we face the wide array of artificial minds that will soon be among us. Understanding whether or not advanced AI is conscious is as important as any other moral question. You have an ethical obligation to call an ambulance if you find your neighbor critically injured, and you would suddenly have similar obligations toward artificially intelligent beings if you knew they were conscious. However, in discussions about less complex forms of consciousness that versions of panpsychism point to, such as those that might exist in a thermostat or an electron, concepts like happiness and suffering don't apply, and any intuition that the scope of our ethics extends to systems vastly different from ourselves seems premature. The questions in neuroscience that concern human suffering, is Amanda's experience successfully being put on hold under anesthesia, for instance, are clearly the most urgent for scientists to address at this time. It's also important to say once again that the two different lines of inquiry I have sketched out are not mutually exclusive, but they will probably always remain isolated from one another to a large degree. For example, we could discover that consciousness is ubiquitous, yet simultaneously know that one's specific experience ceases to exist under certain neurological conditions when that person is, in effect, unconscious, such as being in a coma or under anesthesia. Additionally, it seems probable that only complex minds are capable of great happiness and great suffering. In that case, even if a version of panpsychism were true, not all islands of consciousness would be equal or equally important to understand. The fact remains that integrated and complex minds like ours are capable of immense suffering, and we should be motivated to help all beings avoid it whenever possible. And if we were limited to investigating only one path to solving the mystery of consciousness at a time, which thankfully we're not, I would prioritize work like Anil Seth's and Giulio Tononi's. Nevertheless, the deeper mysteries are clearly worthy of continued scientific study and are currently in need of defense, to protect the values of curiosity and inquiry in our pursuit of knowledge. I agree with a conclusion that Murray Shanahan, a professor of cognitive robotics at Imperial College London, arrives at. To situate human consciousness within a larger space of possibilities strikes me as one of the most profound philosophical projects we can undertake. It is also a neglected one. With no giants upon whose shoulders to stand, the best we can do is cast a few flares into the darkness. It seems clear that the overall picture we currently have, along with a long list of questions lacking definitive answers, gives us good reason to keep thinking about consciousness in more creative ways, and specifically to continue entertaining the idea that consciousness goes deeper than our intuitions have led us to believe. Inquiry into the nature of consciousness, however, will move forward only if it is considered a mystery worthy of our curiosity. 8. Consciousness and time. After 10 minutes of practicing meditation together in silence, the second-grade students in my mindfulness class raised their hands to volunteer to share their experiences. The first child to speak made a simple yet profound observation. "It's always the present moment, but there is no present moment. It keeps moving," she exclaimed, excited by the sheer wonderment of her realization. It was delightful to watch her discover how the mystery of consciousness is related to the mystery of time. Our awareness is experienced across time and cannot be separated from it. Many neuroscientists have considered the possibility that the feeling we have of being in the present moment, with time continuously moving in one direction, is an illusion. In his book, Your Brain is a Time Machine, Dean Buonamano, a UCLA neuroscientist, explains that whether the flow of time is an illusion or a true insight into the nature of reality depends in part on which of these two opposing views in physics turns out to be correct. 1. Presentism. Time is in fact flowing and only the present moment is real. Or 2. Eternalism. We live in a block universe where time is more like space. Just because you are in one location, or moment, doesn't mean the others don't exist simultaneously. Buonamano explains the difficulty of addressing the nature of time. These two views offer incompatible notions of the nature of time, but they both consider our feeling of the passage of time to represent a fundamental problem. Resolving this problem, however, will prove to be a formidable task, as our subjective sense of time sits at the center of a perfect storm of unsolved scientific mysteries: consciousness, free will, relativity, quantum mechanics, and the nature of time. In the perplexing world of quantum physics, John Wheeler's delayed choice experiment, an experiment inspired by the results of the classic double-slit experiment, adds an even more mysterious layer to the question of how time relates to consciousness. In the double-slit experiment in quantum mechanics, when light is directed at a plate in which there are two parallel slits, the light acts like a wave. It passes through both slits and results in an interference pattern on a screen placed behind the slits. This is true even if the light is emitted one photon at a time. This means that somehow an interference pattern is still created even though there is no actual interference we can detect between individual photons according to classical physics. It's as though each photon, wave-like, had passed through both slits simultaneously. However, if a measurement is made at the slits to determine which of them each individual photon passes through, the photons then act like particles, passing through one or the other of the slits and forming two parallel bands on the screen, as particles would be expected to do, and not the interference pattern. This experiment tells us that light acts differently depending on whether or not it is being measured. Without a measurement, light acts like a wave, and when it is measured, it takes on the characteristics of individual particles. Some have made the claim that in order for light to behave like particles, not only does a measurement have to be made, but that measurement has to be consciously observed. I'm not sure how anyone can definitively state that consciousness is implicated in the strangeness of the double-slit experiment, and here I follow the overwhelming consensus among scientists, including Wheeler, that photons exist in many possible states at once until interacting with something but the something needn't be a conscious something. This would change, of course, if we were to discover that consciousness is fundamental to matter, as consciousness would then be associated with all measurement by definition. As if these results weren't strange enough, Wheeler introduced the element of time and made the prediction that even if we perform such a measurement after a photon has passed through one of the slits, we would still get the same effect, causing the photon to act like a particle retroactively. In other words, he predicted that a measurement in the present would mysteriously influence the past. This is the delayed choice experiment, and it was finally conducted in 2007, confirming Wheeler's prediction. Wheeler also proposed a related thought experiment in which he imagined measuring a single photon from the light emitted by a quasar billions of light years away, passing by a black hole on its way to a telescope on Earth. Just as in the double slit experiment, the light would be split by the gravitational effect of the black hole, causing the phenomenon known as gravitational lensing, an optical illusion in which we see multiple images of a single source, such as a quasar. In an interview with the author Rob Reed, Donald Hoffman, a cognitive scientist at the University of California, Irvine, explains what would happen if we measured a single photon in Wheeler's cosmological thought experiment. You can now ask for each photon that comes to me whether it came from the left or the right side of the gravitational lens. Let's say I decide to measure which side it came from, and I find out that it went on the left side. That means I can say that for the last 10 billion years, that photon has been on a path that started from the quasar and went around the left side of the gravitational lens. But if instead I had chosen not to make that measurement and just measure the interference pattern, it would not be true that for the last 10 billion years, that photon had gone down a path around the left side. So the choice I make today determines the 10 billion year history of that photon. In addition to the already incomprehensible facts that Wheeler's experiment reveals about light, if consciousness is in fact somehow intrinsic to matter, his experiment also suggests a very strange and counterintuitive relationship between consciousness and time. Leaving the mind-twisting nature of quantum mechanics aside, let's return to the relative simplicity of our human experience in the present moment. Regardless of the actual nature of time, we know that our conscious experience doesn't represent the sequence of events in the world accurately. We have seen that through different processes, the brain binds information that arrives at our sense receptors at different times and delivers it to us as a neat present moment package. But we can still wonder how conscious experience itself relates to time. Paying close attention to one's moment-to-moment experience through a concentration exercise like meditation, or simply contemplating the mystery of one's felt experience in general, leads to many interesting questions pertaining to time. How much time does a moment of consciousness take? Is consciousness continuous, or does it somehow flicker in and out? And how would we know the difference? What is the present moment? Is it some sort of illusion? Is time itself an illusion? Not only are all the questions surrounding consciousness important, especially as scientists and philosophers enter into the age of superintelligent machines, but they are fascinating to contemplate. In The Telltale Brain, V.S. Ramachandran ponders the chances of science uncovering the mystery of consciousness. Such advances could easily be as remote from our present-day grasp as molecular genetics was to those living in the Middle Ages, unless there is a potential Einstein of neurology lurking around somewhere. From our current vantage point, it seems unlikely that we will ever arrive at a true understanding of consciousness. However, we may well be wrong about the absolute boundaries of knowledge. Humanity is young, and we've barely begun to understand our place in the cosmos. As we continue to look out from our planet and contemplate the nature of reality, we should remember that there is a mystery right here where we stand.